All right, so I will welcome everyone. This is the second M-Team budget meeting of Lincoln County. I believe we have most of the M-Team members present virtually. And I'm going to start out with a few comments and then have Christina kind of give us a financial update and then open it to discussion and see where we go from there. At our last meeting, I think it was the sheriff and some others had some questions about reserves and general fund cash days. So Christina is going to present a slide that the Board of Commissioners saw yesterday about general fund cash days. I will tell you in the last 3 years, we've gone from 110 to 104 to 96, and that is as of fiscal year end June 30, 2020. It does not look better for the estimation of the fiscal year ending June 30, 2021, but Christina will have some specifics on that. The efforts of everyone to look for additional revenues and reduced expenses result in about $1 million in savings, which leaves us with a deficit still of about $4.1 million. We discussed a couple of ways last time to address that, possible budgeting of vacancies, possible reduction in material services expense, and I'll throw the other option out on the table, a reduction in staff. So with that, I'll ask Christina to kind of go through the slide that I think you all can see. That's general fund cash days. This was a slide the Board of Commissioners saw yesterday. The bottom right figure should be 2020. They're not 2 years in a row of 2019. Unless there are some questions from the group as we get started, I'll turn it over to Christina from here.
Okay, well, actually this slide is pretty self-explanatory. I mean, you can see that from 2010 through about 2018, and these are fiscal years, not calendar years, we had a general increase in our general fund ending balance, which is essentially, that's what this days in cash is. At the end of a fiscal year, how many days of operations can we fund with the balance that was left over from last year? That's what this metric means. From 2018, 2019, and 2020, which this should be 2020, we've seen a fall off of that number. So we're essentially spending our reserves on operations, is what this is telling us. The auditor has a particular way of calculating this. I've got a shorthand way that I put on the worksheet that I sent out to you all, the general fund summary. But it's the pattern that matters more than the specific metric, whether this is 76 or 79 or 80. What we're really looking at is what does this general trend tell us? And what our general trend is telling us is that we are outspending our revenues. And that means that we're running our general fund ending balance down. And it's not because we've done a major capital project or acquired a building or anything one time in nature. It's just everyday operations, by and large. So that's really what this metric is telling us. And so that kind of puts in context the issue that we have in front of us today, which is how to present a balanced budget. We have to be cognizant of the fact that there's only so much time that you can do this kind of pattern before you basically can't balance the budget and have to do something drastic. Are we there today? I think that's a matter of discussion, definitely. Because if we look at where we're trending, we're going in the wrong direction. So we need to figure out either how to raise revenues or cut expenses, because that's how you balance the budget.
Christine, I'm going to say too that use of reserves is a one-time source of funds. So each year as we use reserves, we continue to eat up the total amount of reserves, which is reflected in the downward trend of that slide.
And that's why it starts trending sharper every year because you have less to work with the next year. So, any questions about this?
Christina, can you maybe provide or maybe that's what's next, so I might be jumping the gun here, but can you provide some more in-depth detail on where some of those trends are coming from in terms of overspending? Is this personnel, that sort of thing? Oh, there we go. Thank you.
I will tell you, this is primarily the cause. Our personal services growth rate is vastly outstripping our general revenue growth rate. Our general revenue growth rate is about 3% a year, which is very healthy, very normal. But our personal services have grown more than that. Materials and services is also part of that, but it's less so. So if we go here, you can see, we go from 8.7 to 10.7, so $2 million worth of growth in 4 years. But personnel services goes from 23 million to 27 million, so $4 million of growth in 4 years. Our revenues just are not growing that fast.
I might add another way to look at it. As you hire people, those costs compound year over year. And so we're starting to see, we are now experiencing the compounding of some of the personnel decisions we made a couple of years ago that are with compounding expenses having an adverse impact on the budget.
That is one element. It is not the only element, though. We do have a net increase in positions in the general fund that is fairly significant. We've added, oh my gosh, Deanna, you had this number in front of you. Do you still? I want to say it's about 20 positions in the last 5 years. That's a lot. A position on average costs us about $100,000 a year.
Christina, that's 20 positions in the general fund?
Yes. I'm sorry. We went in 2016-17, we had 228.66 positions. We now have for 2021, we have 258.68 positions. Now, some of this is structural in that we changed a couple things. We brought select patrol positions, which used to be in that fund. They're now in the sheriff's office. So, there's a little bit of that going on. But just in pure position growth, we're looking at over 20 positions in a relatively short period of time.
Christina, the $100,000 you quoted roughly per employee, do you mean per employee or per 1.0 FTE?
Per FTE, full-time employee. But that is an average. And so when you have employees that cost more than that, you have a lot of employees that cost less than that. So that is just a pure average, unweighted.
Oh, understood.
Claire, you have a question? We can't hear you, Claire. Still can't hear you.
The mute button is being bonky today. No, I don't. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, I saw your green mic. That's why I asked. All right, back to you, Christina. You're mute.
Turn. There we go. Sorry about that. So basically, to summarize where we're at this point, as I pointed out in the reports that I sent out on Friday, we're currently sitting at $4.1 million out of balance. So we basically have to figure out how to come up with either $4.1 million worth of additional revenue or $4.1 million of cuts or some combination thereof in order to balance the budget. So that's my summary. I'm certainly open for questions.
What does 4.1 million mean in terms of its percentage of the overall budget?
It's about 10%.
10%.
If our total budget is $41 million, and that's basically spendable budget, then $4.1 million is about 10%.
Because just since I've been here 9 years, it seemed like we were just coming out of the recession in 2012, and I was brand new to the budget process when I came on board, but it seemed like every year since then, after we figured out how much the board in particular, figured out how much ought to be in reserves, then we started talking about, how do we add back positions to make us whole after the recession when we had to do a lot of layoffs. So that's sort of my own perspective on what we've been doing for 9 years, is that at this stage, we would be provided information from finance about, all right, here's where we are. Here are the decisions about what kind of reserves we want to leave. And then we all had together sort of like, there might be 2 or 3 FTEs to think about. And that's what our discussions were largely about. That we all made pitches about, that kind of level of growth. So, given that incremental up, trending up though, and I think the question was asked, of course, last time, how did we sort of get here so quickly and I don't want to belabor that, because we got to figure out what to do. It's not about how we got here as much as what do we do now. But I thought for M team members that hadn't been part of this process in the past, that's certainly the way I always thought about it, that we had the luxury. It's a lot more fun to be thinking about having enough to add a couple FTEs and then having a little bit of tug of war among ourselves about who's going to get what. So I'll stand down and I just been meaning to provide that institutional memory that I've had about this process for the last 9 years.
All right, I recognize Roy and then Wayne. Roy's been around a while too.
I don't like the way that sounds. I still feel like the new guy. How's that? Question. For 21-22 personal service expenses, is some COLA already calculated into that, or is that without COLAs?
Chris, there you go.
That is without COLA. So any increases due to the LTEA contract, anything that we do for the unreps is going to add to that. It is not currently in the budget.
I was hoping that we could, dodge that bullet just by a freeze. No?
Unfortunately, no.
All right, Wayne, and then I think Curtis, you had your hand up.
Well, just a notation in terms of one of the things that we have done this year that really differs from previous years is that we conglomerated when we were talking about reserves, and you look at the reserves over the course of the years, it conglomerated both restricted and unrestricted. And we didn't do, I think probably in hindsight, a good enough job to differentiate between those that were restricted for a specific purpose and those that were unrestricted. So we had a pretty significant growth in our reserves during the course of the last 2 or 3 years. But that was restricted funding. It wasn't the unrestricted reserves. So this year, there are some changes in the budget. You'll notice that remove some of the activities, both the expense, but also the revenue from the unrestricted general fund. The general fund is becoming more of what are the discretionary dollars we have to spend versus what are the things that have to be spent for a specific purpose. And getting that clarification, makes us now have to sharpen our pencils a lot more when we look at this and really make that differentiation between truly unrestricted funds and those that are restricted for a specific purpose. So I just wanted to note that that has something to do with where we're at right now too.
Sheriff.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, Wayne touched on a little bit of my question, and I'm not sure I know how to ask it, so I'm just going to ramble a little bit here and see if I can get a question out. But on that topic with the Community Corrections Fund, on that, I assume that's probably the majority of that transfer out that's listed under the 21-22 fund. And that is, so the personnel services, first question would be the personnel service, I think I asked this last time, does not include those employees in there. So that growth is minus all the employees from community corrections. So it's mainly the COLAs for our association, which are under contract, and also step increases. That's a big increase. So that's really a lot larger than what it would. It's actually a lot larger because we actually pulled out a bunch of employees too, correct?
Yes, that is absolutely true. If community corrections was in here, this number would be closer to $30 million.
Okay, and then my second question, and this is one that I'm having difficulty wording, is with those number of days dropping, is that prior to the community corrections transfer out? So, and if so, how is that going to affect it next year? Because I know with that transfer out, that was originally calculated in our beginning fund balance because of their carryover money every year. So are we, even if we do, make the cuts of the 4 million and have a balance, are we going to, and things are good next year, are we still going to show a significant loss of those operating days because of that transfer going out this year being 21, or is it already reflected? I guess I'm trying to say, are we still with that transfer out and taking away those beginning fund balances? Is it going to look worse next year when that's calculated in?
No, and the reason why is this calculation, for the projection for 22, as long as these reserves, which are the reserves remaining after the parole and probation transfer is made, as long as these reserves are reflective or are maintained, then we should have our 61 days, which is the board policy reserve for fund balance. What has happened that those increasing balances were partially because those restricted funds, those, as Wayne pointed out, the unrestricted fund balance, or the restricted fund balances related to parole and probation were growing. The unrestricted balance of the general fund was shrinking, but it was masked by the growth of those restricted funds. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Now, by eliminating those, this number will be a better and truer reflection of our financial position.
Okay, yeah, I agree with that, and thank you for understanding my questions. I don't think I phrased it very well even in my mind about looking forward. And then my last comment would be, or question, in that contingency, that $5.9 million contingency, is any of that on the table to help address that $4.1 million deficit?
That is a policy call by the BOC. At this point, all I did was plug in the board policy amount.
I just kind of guess throwing that out there for discussion to see if that was going to move that needle, or if we're going to, again, like Anno pointed out, what's the problem that we need to solve today?
Well, I won't answer the question, but I'll point out some information. Using the bottom row of numbers there, the ones that are comparable is the actual 2019-2020 of 97 days, and then we are now projecting the 84 days, and if we keep our reserves at the level as shown on the screen, our reserves will go down to 61 days. So if we reduce the reserves further, that 61 days will drop lower. And again, we're 97, 84, 61.
So just to illustrate the point, I went ahead and just said, if I artificially reduce that reserve number by $4 million, which is roughly where our shortfall is, that takes our days reserve down to 23 days, which is not something I would ever recommend.
It's something I couldn't support.
And then I've made comments in the past that, if this is the trend we're looking at, and especially over the next 5 years, we should probably, bite the bullet and look at cuts so that we can be at least not in this position every year and start, looking forward. But the one thing that and I know that we probably are reluctant, especially after listening to the meeting yesterday, about using at this point, but I guess, and I'll just state my opinion, I'd be reluctant to make those cuts this year because We know that the American Recovery Act is going to provide us with $9.6 million. We just don't know what the restrictions or what the rules are going to be. So I guess I'd be reluctant to go down that road. This year, knowing that money's coming, it can help us out for a couple of years to maybe rebalance again exactly what it's made for. A lot of the expenditures that came out this year, a lot of that we had were from costs that we didn't think were coming with COVID. We had the fires, and I think that that money is going to help us with a lot of expenditures that we didn't anticipate this year. And so I guess my opinion is I'd be reluctant to make those significant cuts, knowing that that's coming and the restrictions could be loose enough that it actually helps us with that deficit.
I'll point out the COVID money or the ARP money is one-time money, so it may help us in the short run, but in the meantime, our personnel expenses are compounding and making our situation worse.
But it is a pretty substantial one-time cost.
Well, Sheriff, I can tell you this. From what we
Go ahead,
know
Wayne.
already, I was going to say, from what we know at this point, this is not, don't make the mistake of thinking that's $9.6 million. It's discretion, at our discretion to spend. It is not. I can tell you that categorically. We're getting more information on what it can be utilized for, but it's not, we don't qualify from what we know at this point to backfill our entire general fund budget with $9.6 million. So we got to be extremely careful, which is why I tried to say, stay away from that money right now. We're getting more information that's going to come forward. We'll see where that can go. But so it's more than what Commissioner Hunt was saying, that it's one-time money. It's also restricted at one-time money.
Katie?
Thanks. Part of what I was going to say, Council Belmont just said, but I guess I would just add on the money that's coming. First off, checks in the mail, right? So we're still waiting for that to actually get here and understand it, as Wayne just said. It is going to be restricted. I think there is going to be some costs that are reimbursable that we have incurred this year, as Sheriff Lander said, that we did not anticipate spending out of the general fund. So I think there is going to be some relief in that. But in looking at this and seeing that we are likely overstaffed by a few positions, it's not going to solve the issue. But I do think that understanding that money a little bit, and I know we're all trying to understand what's coming, is worthwhile before we go to, measures of potentially cutting staff or those higher conversations, because I think it will help us in some ways. We're still determining what those ways are. So I do agree with Sheriff Landers that understanding that a little bit more before we do some drastic things is going to be helpful, but I don't think it's going to solve all of our problems.
Others?
Yeah.
Claire, your mic's on. Do you have something to say? I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. My desktop went wonky, and so I signed on my phone. I would like to throw in, but you recognized a couple of other people, so why don't you go to them first?
Okay. I think we're to you, Arnold.
Well, just to help me understand that in the past, so reserves and contingency, again, dumb question. They're not the same thing, or they are the same thing? And that's the first question. And the follow-up is, can we get some kind of recent, just generalized history of what it's been like? Have we had to, when we budgeted a certain amount for contingency, did we find ourselves dipping into it a lot, or was it just every once in a while, or what does that look like in terms of what we've done in the last few years?
We almost always dip into contingency at some point in the following year. Order of magnitude, it varies greatly. Sometimes a little bit, sometimes a lot. But in recent memory, I can't think of a single fiscal year where we did not get contingency for something. And that's honestly why it's there. It's for those things that you just don't know about in April, and it comes up later in the fiscal year. As far as reserves and contingency, for the most part, you can use them interchangeably. They function essentially the same way. It's budgeted to balance the budget so that your revenues equal your budget, but you can't spend it without action by the BOC to reclass it to a spendable account, such as, personal services, materials and services, debt services, that kind of thing. So the typical reserves, and I'll differentiate here for you a little bit. Debt service is a common one, and that's why that's on this unappropriated line, because it basically means we're not going to spend it. That's next year's debt service, and we always keep that we hold that holy, kind of, to paraphrase. The rest of the contingency is kind of broken down. Compensated absences. We owe employees money if they leave us for their vacation balances and other benefit packages that we have. So we have reserves for those. That's a financial thing that we have to book. The rest of it can be earmarked or not, but it's just kind of grouped together in this contingency bucket for display purposes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I of course, the purpose of the question is to follow up on Curtis's, I think, point of if we're going to try to, punt this year without having to do layoffs, what is that? Is that any kind of, what does that scenario look like? How do we make that, if that's possible, make that happen? Because I think we all would like to understand that. I mean, at the very least, if that's even a possibility there to achieve.
Well, largely that's a policy call, and that's part of the reason why we're having this conversation, is so that everyone can understand what's going on. But as a practical matter, I don't think you can do it by just reducing your reserves. I don't think that I would not at all recommend that. I think there has to be some sort of combination. And maybe this is the segue we need, Doug, if it's okay, to talk about vacancy savings.
Sure.
Okay.
I was waiting for an opportunity. You've created it. Go ahead.
All right. So one of the things that we talked about last time was this vacancy savings concept that we introduced in this current budget. And you wanted calculations based on what our history is in vacancy savings. And this number here, this is our growth in personal services. That's not our history in vacancy. And what I'll show you is, let me bring up the wrong, there it is. All right, hang on. Here we go. So our historical vacancy savings rate varies. You can see it was a high of 7.2 several years ago. This is what we're projecting for this year, but you have to remember, this is part of, we started our 6-month holding open positions, not filling positions if we don't need to. So that's how we generated a 9% savings in fiscal 20. We're on track to essentially meet or possibly exceed our budget in personal services for this year. So our effective vacancy savings rate for fiscal 21 is 7.5%, because that's what we budgeted. But historically, you can see we have varying degrees, and a lot of it just depends on the ebbs and flows of people leaving, because it was kind of accidental in the past, whereas it's more deliberate now. So that is why I calculated 2 different vacancy savings rates. 5%, which is probably closer to our average vacancy savings, and 7.5%, which is what we budgeted this year. If we go with the 7.5% number, that's $2 million. But what that means is we have to continue to aggressively hold open positions. And, that has had varying degrees of success. And, just to be honest, and like I say, we may get to that 7.5%. We're not on track for it now. We're going to exceed a little bit there, just because we just haven't been successful in holding it open for a lot of various reasons. It's a difficult thing to do. So it's really a policy decision. I do think we need to budget vacancy savings. The question is how much?
So Christine, if I can clarify, I'm not sure what you said relative to, in the current budget, we budgeted a 7.5% vacancy rate. Do you think we will be above that or below that? In other words, will we meet our budgeted vacancy rate, or will we exceed the rate, which would be more savings, or fail to reach the rate, which would be more expense?
At this point in time, we are trending in the general fund to slightly exceed our expenditures in personal services. So that means we will not meet the 7.5% vacancy rate. It'll be more like 7.2, something along those lines. It's not dramatic, and there's still time to turn it around. And so we may still, but that the last time we looked at that, we're on track kind of to come in either by the skin of our teeth or a little bit over.
Questions, comments?
This is Todd.
Go ahead, Todd.
I guess I'm not really confused on the budget. I'm just kind of confused on the solution. If we do the budget, if we budget for the vacancy savings, that's still going to leave us a $2 million nut that we have to cover. Are we going to try and pull that out of personal services? I guess what I'm getting at sitting on the kind of the sidelines listening, it seems like we're going to have layoffs no matter what we do. Because $2 million is just as unattainable in pulling it out of our materials and services as $4 million does.
There's nothing wrong with your math, Todd. You're kind of hitting the nail on the head there. Last year we did budget a reduction of materials and services. I believe that was 10%. We could do that again, and that would be $1 million. So that would leave us with another $1 million to find. At our average rate of what employees cost us, that would be 10 positions. Now, knowing that we have bargaining agreements and so forth and bumping rights and so forth, it could actually be more than that, because if you have to lay off your most recent and cheapest employees first, you may not get that 100,000 for each position. So those are the kinds of decisions that we have to make. We need to figure out what combination of cuts we want to do. Vacancy savings, materials and services cuts. Do we look at other discretionary items in our budget, in our general fund budget? There may be things that we need to re-examine that we've historically done, but maybe we need to look at whether or not we, in the short term or even the long term, continue to do them.
Christine, Todd, go ahead.
I was just going to say, from a materials and services section, I mean, when you asked us to come up with more savings, that's the only place I had to dive. So I've already given up everything that I can. I mean, it wasn't as much as I had hoped, but it was, I think, substantial. And I just don't think we can pull more out of materials and services.
And see, this is precisely why you don't want me making these decisions, is because I don't have the boots on the ground. This is why this group is so valuable in this process. Because if I'm looking at a spreadsheet, to me, it's like, 10% of materials and services is $1 million. Woohoo! But there's a real cost to that. There's a real operational impact. And I'm not in a position to assess that. And that's really why this group is here and doing this process.
I think there's some value in coming up with a vacancy rate. Until today's meeting, I felt that even though 7.5% was very aggressive, we might need to be aggressive to solve some of the budget challenges we have. If we're not going to make it this year, I'm a little hesitant to budget it again for next year, but is there an in-between number of 6%, 6.5%? That probably be somewhere in the neighborhood of what, 1.7 million?
Yep.
Which would be a significant reduction in the 4.1 million. Go ahead, Arnold.
Is it fair to ask, which,
Sure.
which department that, holding open vacancies would hit the most? Because I don't have, and I don't have empty slots right now. I want to be able to have an environmental health specialist, but it would be paid with new revenue. And if the state legislature in their infinite wisdom gives us 3 years of resources to hire another planner, God knows I could use the person. That's not on this budget, but I think in the spirit of trying to understand what that means for other members of the M team, whose ox would really be gored by not filling positions right now.
Well, first and foremost, public safety. They have the most FTE. You do this kind of savings calculation, it's going to hit the departments with the most employees. How that plays out on the ground, that's obviously something that, we would have to discuss with Sheriff Landers. But at this point, it's just a number. So it's 7.5% of total personal services. And if you put that into play and don't tweak where that goes, it's going to land pretty much on public safety, because that's where the dollars are. That's not to say that we can't allocate it differently.
Christina,
Go ahead, Mike.
have you budgeted in the labor agreement increases? So
Only
anything,
the ones that are already in place. So LCDA's increases are already there.
all right, so then anything that we add to that exacerbates the situation.
Yes.
Mike was getting a shot for those of you that didn't realize he arrived late.
I'm fully vaccinated. Thank you, Rebecca.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yep.
So
I'm sorry, Eli, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I have a question about the spreadsheet. If you could scroll down just a few rows on the spreadsheet. There's the line 66, current revenue minus current expense. Going back to 17-18, so it looks like we had more revenue than expense. 18-19 looks like we about broke even. 19-20 was looks like about $1 million more in expenses than revenue. And then 2021, it looks like we're spending $3.5 million more. And
Well, that's the budget. Yeah.
right. And there's an asterisk there which says including, is that adjustments? So
Yeah.
adjusted to that. And this is sort of following on Sheriff Landers and Wayne's previous discussion of what might be reimbursable things. So if we amended our budget to spend $3.5 million more than we're bringing in, how much of that do we think is going to be covered in eligible reimbursables?
That 3.4 last year's budget, you'll notice that this days of cash reserves is under the board goal. So we actually budgeted to spend just our base budget more than we were going to bring in general fund revenue. Most of the budget adjustments for this year have reflected new revenue, most of it COVID revenue. And there's only a few small adjustments that were made that actually impacted contingency. So the bulk of this money was that we decided to do that last year when we adopted this budget, that we would spend our general fund balance. So, I mean, your train of thought is right on. It's following the trends that I'm seeing and noticing and coming back once again to our revenues growing at about a 3% rate, and our expenses are growing at a much larger rate, at closer to 6%. And as a result, we keep spending our beginning fund balance a little bit more every year. Now, you'll notice our projection is actually much better, and a lot of that is due to additional revenue that we've received that we did not budget. We don't necessarily automatically do budget adjustments for all of the new revenue. We only budget we only make adjustments to our budget if we actually want to spend that revenue. So that's why this position is much better than we budgeted. This beginning fund balance here of 9.6 is much better than the 4.8 that we thought we were going to end up with. But it's still problematic because even with all of that, you know, a bigger beginning fund balance, additional revenue, all of that, we're still spending $1 million more than what we're going to bring in terms of and expenses. Does that answer your question?
And cash days are projected to fall from 97 to 84.
Yes. So it's one of those things that's intuitive. We're doing much better than we thought we were going to do. It's still just a degree of not as bad rather than better. Does that make sense? Okay. Other questions, suggestions?
Wayne?
So historically, this is not unusual for us to be having these kinds of discussions at the front end of the budget process, remembering that this is the front end of the budget process. Although we did from the first M-team meeting, you know, go back and look at our budgets and make some changes. And I think Christina said that reduced the deficit by $1 million. But I think we can do more. I have been looking some more at the budget since the numbers Christina gave us last week. I see some other places that we could improve in a couple of ways. And I'm talking about real improvements, not just money on numbers on a spreadsheet. And so I'd like to suggest that we take an opportunity, and I'll do what I used to do. I haven't done it for several years, but I'll look at the entire budget and I'll go through and I'll see some things that may that are being made, and have some discussions with some of you about expenditures that you're projecting and what that really means, and see if we can improve our bottom line this fiscal year, what's projected for 2021, and then some of the department requests. I already know of a couple I've been working on with Tony and the sheriff and some others that will benefit us positively. That aren't yet, because we don't have the specific numbers, are not yet plugged into the budget. So I think there's some things we can look at for 21, 22 and whittle this down. It would be, I think, extremely important to know, though, as a policy matter, maybe that's one thing we could discuss right now, to at least have a target on the vacancy rate, so we know what we're working for and what we're looking at. And I would suggest we go back and again sharpen our pencils again and do this kind of work to see if we can't reduce this even more than it is now. It's going to take a lot of work on our part, but I think that's an effort that's worth our while to do.
Doug, this is Claire. Could I ask actually a question for Wayne? A question for Wayne. You know, we discussed this with our auditor briefly. I know you've been having conversations with other people, but the American Recovery Act money, we do know, at least generally, that it's not going to be unrestricted money, but we don't even really have a good clue, unfortunately, yet when we're gonna get some clear guidance on that, do we?
We don't. There's a couple of meetings coming up in the next 2 weeks, in which we're going to get some more information, including some information from our congressional delegation as to what they understand. We do know that at least in accordance with the law, the first tranche of money will be released during this fiscal year. So we'll be able to at least look at some of it. Now, again, I guess if you're getting your personal stimulus money, it's supposed to be received right now.
Right.
I have not yet received that, so I guess I would wait until the money's actually in the bank until I really rely on it for anything. But that's scheduled according to the legislation, is that first tranche of money would come to us within 60 days of the passage of the act, and that's this fiscal year. So we can wait to see. But again, that's not going to be the panacea. It doesn't solve the structural problems and issues we've got to deal with here. It may buy us the time, as the sheriff was indicating, to take some action, and very deliberate action that we have to take over the course of 1 or 2 fiscal years. But it's not going to be the be-all, end-all, and it certainly doesn't solve issues on a go-forward basis for.
I'm sorry. Yeah, exactly. Thinking about, there's only a few of us left now, it seems like, who went through the recession more than a decade ago. But, essentially we took the hit over 2 years, if I remember correctly, fiscal 9, fiscal 10. And, some counties dragged it out for years and years. I don't want to, get us in the position where we're like lemmings, and then all of a sudden we have to start, really doing radical things. On the other hand, finding that sweet spot in the middle, at least making some structural adjustments this year, and then if nothing, then perhaps having the mindset that when we come back next year, we might have to look at this kind of exercise for a second time.
I have said several times, and I'll say it again, and I'll just pick some numbers that are easy. If we're trying to make $2 million in cuts and we do it over 2 years, that's $1 million a year. If we do $2 million in cuts in 1 year, that's $2 million. So, as was done back with the recession, making cuts over a year or two has some attractions. But I still think we've got some structural issues that need to be addressed. And I don't know what my fellow commissioners feel. The question was asked about vacancy rates. I propose something like 6.5. That would be a step in the right direction. It would help. It's not going to solve the problem, but that's my thoughts.
That sounds realistic to me.
Mike, well, I don't know. Roy, you had your hand up, then Mike.
Quick question. I know, over on the roadside, we're over the next fiscal year going to have multiple retirements. And I'm wondering if throughout all the other departments, if each individual director has an idea of if there's going to be a retirement or if there's going to be some kind of separation. If they, and I'm not saying that we would leave those vacant, but if they're replaced, usually they're replaced at a lesser wage, a lesser salary, a lesser expense. Is there any way for everybody to go and take a look at basically who's going to be gone, from somewhere between July 1st of 21 and June of 22, and kind of calculate where the personal expenses are going to be saved on that, the budget somehow?
But then make sure you're also, whatever outgoing costs that creates, that those are reconciled.
Right. Well, yeah, because there's buyouts for all that too.
Yep.
Buyout.
Yeah.
Mike,
No,
and then
Christina's smiling. I'm sorry, Christina's smiling, and that's why, because that has been plugged in, Roy, for some that we know the positions are going to be vacated this year. coming.
Or-
Any person come to mind,
Significant
Wayne?
positions that
No,
we
I'm not
know.
gonna say who it is, yeah.
We have done some of that, and traditionally, we're doing that. Part of the reason, the vacancies happen, vacancy savings happen. We don't normally budget for retirements or departure payoffs because we're assuming we're gonna make that up on the backside in that year with savings. So we always, that's why we don't try and elevate for retirements and or departures and deflate for vacancies normally, because we assume that's gonna be something that will wash. What we're trying to do by lengthening the period of time between someone departing and rehiring, we're trying to create more savings rather than more that wash that tends to happen. So Roy, your point is well taken. If you know somebody, if anybody knows that somebody is going to retire next year or has very good information, and we haven't already included it, and you probably would know if we have because we've talked to you about it, then let us know. And we'll figure out if we can go ahead and budget that difference. But for the several positions that have a significant impact on department budgets, we've already done some of that work.
Roy, do you have any more questions on Mike? Okay, Mike?
Well, I just wanted to say that there's a couple things here is that we need to remember and understand that just kind of lopping off and doing it just one, and I think Wayne alluded to this, we just can't have one size fits all for how we go about accomplishing getting the curtailments that we need. For example, it would be suicide, I think, and this is not, Ano didn't pay me to say this, but it would be suicide to think that we can cut planning right now because it's a revenue generator. So that needs, I think, to be looked at in a little bit different lens. I think that, some of the people that we have pass-throughs that have the large amount of pass-throughs like Royd and HHS, that's a little bit different story too, because the problem that we have is really in the general fund and how are we able to kind of get that in shape. I think that there are some small departments like us that you can say, all right, you got to save your target this year, and realizing that everybody is going to have to go through some exercise like this, but I think that we've got to be pliable enough that we look at this thing in a context of the whole. Where are the numbers where are we going to be able to produce the numbers, and how are we going to reduce the services of inconvenience to the public? Put together a team. I mean, we've got a lot of good people on M team, but this is going to be, I think, some hard work. So my suggestion would be to work with Wayne on a couple of these things. Got to take a close look at this, and we got to figure out some cuts that are going to be meaningful. So no offense, Wayne, you're sharp troop and all that, but I just think that the more fingerprints that we have on this, I think you have the group as a whole. That's all I'm going to say.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Well, we have a lot of ideas.
And again, the clarity on the CARES Act stuff, the best case scenario.
It's the American Recovery Plan. ARP. Well, it's going to be down the pike a little bit. The money may come to us in 60 days, but the guidance may not come that soon. I'd be surprised if it comes that soon. We'll see.
Well, Paul, the auditor yesterday even said, well, you may get the money and then you'll get the guidance and then we'll make all the entries and then they'll change the rules and we'll have, my concern is if we, any really significant reliance on that money to solving our problem, number one, I'm not sure that we'll be able to use it the way we think we might. Number two, really doesn't, as I said earlier, it's one-time money. structural problem. It may enable us to drag it out a little, but there's some downside of that too. And
Well, the thing to remember in terms of this revenue expense mismatch is there's no plausible scenario where our operating revenue grows, say, on a sustainable basis by 10% or more. It's just not, there's just no plausible reality where that happens. So we may get influxes of money either through ARP or some other grant program or some other assistance program. It's going to ebb and flow, but our baseline revenue, which is really where we need to try and target our operational expenses to, is going to grow at 3%. And if we don't hold our expenses to that level, we're going to have this conversation year after year after year. That's the part that we need to wrap our heads around and get our arms around.
so what's the pleasure of the group? I'll speak up at once.
Just trying to sort through all the different things that, in terms of who does what next. I mean, wasn't Wayne going to go ahead and do further analysis with, because I've worked closely with him. I always have on my budget, so he's going to do that, right? And so when do you think that's, when do you think the clarity from that process, your engagement will?
Soon. Christina needs to have numbers. She needs to put together a budget here in the not too distant future, within the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, and right now we've only talked about the general fund. All the other funds are still in play. Most of them are in decent shape, but yeah.
So
Okay.
if we're aggressive on not filling positions, and I realize that that's more of a public safety thing. So here I don't mean to be offering up some other department, but if that's one of the pieces, understanding it's not a long-term structural advantage or solution, but at least it gets us into understanding what the federal stuff is going to be. Is that a principled approach, and does that start getting us in the neighborhood of where we need to be? We're still off a mill.
Still have a couple mil.
And, well, yeah, it doesn't resolve the structural problem. Go ahead, Sheriff.
Talking about the 4-point count for any vacancy savings, correct?
That is correct.
So we know there's going to be some. So, whatever figure, maybe the commissioners can come up with at least that number now, so you can plug that in. That gives us more working number to go with, and then Wayne go back and do what he does best. And I know he's already been talking to a couple of us, like he said, and I know that there's, depending what happens, there's already one number. It's going to be pretty significant to make that number turn. And then, I would, just my suggestion, come back and to see where we're at, and then go from there. A week would, if that gives Christine enough time to get things ready for the public meetings. Well, this is a public meeting, but with the budget committee, full meeting.
Well, I guess I'll look to Commissioner Jacobson for thoughts on the vacancy rate.
I guess one of the things I'm feeling, I'm still struggling with a little bit is, and maybe there's been a shift, is the last conversation we had, Sheriff Landers and Laney, who I don't see on here, at least I don't see her face here, but had said that they really sort of favored actually making hard cuts rather than a vacancy rate, because their two departments seem to be getting hit people. And so I guess before coming up with a vacancy rate, I think I'm sort of maybe hearing a slight change in that from Sheriff, but I guess I want to understand that a little bit more.
No, I agree. A couple of things with that, Commissioner, and no, I agree. The vacancy, the 6-month holding is hurting us because we've compounded things, and I was went kind of fast, and maybe Christina can send out that vacancy percentage, but I have a feeling we're gonna go over our 7.5% projection just from the sheriff's office fund because we've basically compounded that. I would be looking for that vacancy rate, as Christina pointed out, that even in years where we didn't set a rate, we were back in 6.8, 6.2 before it was even set. So I think naturally, we automatically, and I know the sheriff's office does, every year we have vacancy savings, regardless of the 6-month waiting period. So I know naturally I'm going to have that already, and so if we can just continue with that natural progression, and maybe as Commissioner Hunt said, make that vacancy savings lower than what our projection was for 7.5%, and that's something I can live with because I'm not in that 6-month waiting period. And then the other part of it is just really, I want to see where Wayne with his calculation, and I know it's going to be months before we're in there, but again, I'm still thinking that the American Rescue Recovery ARP thing is going to help us a little bit, even if we just use a little bit over the next 9 years. And I don't know if that's even going to be possible. If we're going to have to use it all in 1 year. I don't know what the restrictions are going to be. Obviously, no one does. But I think it's going to be a little bit of additional funding there for at least a few years to gradually go into what we need to do and see where revenues start coming in, see if growth is going to continue, see if we can stabilize our personnel costs, do something like that over the next few years. So I know I said a lot, but I would be comfortable with setting that rate. And I know it's kind of contradictory to what I said before, but what really hurts is that 6-month waiting period. If that's the case, then for us anyhow, it's almost just tell me how many positions I have and we'll go. But even doing that, we're going to have vacancy. We're going to have still a vacancy rate, even doing that.
This is Lainey. I agree with Sheriff Landers with continuing with the natural vacancy savings that we have every year. And I know other people mentioned whether people are going to be leaving in the next year, and sort of Christina talked about the numbers on a spreadsheet, but not necessarily the impact, and not being able to see the impact that has. And I just, for everyone's knowledge, we're a department of 33 employees, and we've had 8 quit within the last fiscal year. And I just had another employee turn in give notice yesterday. So it does have a pretty big practical effect. But my point in sharing that is those are all vacancy savings that we naturally have anyway. And so I, along with Sheriff Landers, I think we would meet that. So I am in favor of continuing that natural vacancy savings that we have, and then figuring out what we can do to make up the other shortfall.
The 6% an acceptable natural vacancy rate?
Can, Christina, can you take us back to the other chart you had up before you went to this one? Thanks. Back to Commissioner Hunt's question to me, I was going to fall somewhere between 6 and 6.5. That's kind of where I was coming in.
And I guess just to add to what the DA said, I think instead of having a set every position is 6 months, at least in our office where we have several different positions and several different divisions, if you show that rate, what I need to save, I can adjust my positions over all my divisions to prioritize where my needs are too, and not just take one position that I really need and have to wait 6 months. I can maybe move a position around that way too. It just helps me be more flexible, but still meet that savings that you would be requesting.
More targeted.
So Katie, are you okay with 6.5? Well, I guess is the M team okay with 6.5?
6 or 6.5 is what I'm thinking, but I'm open to feedback.
Sheriff, you comfortable with 6.5? Laney, 6.5? Claire, 6.5?
But that definitely helps the bottom line as far as what we're coming up with. So, I will do our part, but again, just saying what it's going to be, throw those numbers in there, and just having the flexibility to adjust that within our division is going to help me and not have to wait 6 months, which I know is over a year.
Well, I also think that if you get halfway into the fiscal year and we're not address alternative procedures, but I understand. I think that was a good point, though, that within the department, if you know you've got to manage to that. I've said oftentimes, I don't care what you're doing as long as you get the job done. So as long as you're managing to that and make your objective, that's your job. Are you going to put a 6.5 in there, Christina? Yeah, it's going to be what, about 1.8 maybe, roughly. Yeah, not my head. Mike, your hand's up.
I just think that the 900-pound gorilla in the room, whether we like to admit it or not, are the contracts that we have coming up. They haven't been calculated in, so anything that we give are going to exacerbate. And I just think that we need to belly up to the bar and say, all right, we're going to have to, at least for the first year and maybe the second year, distasteful as that may be, I just think that I'm not sure what 1% is worth, Christina, but I would imagine it's probably $400,000 or $500,000 anyhow, just to kind of ballpark in it. And I don't think that we ought to go through this exercise just to kind of give it away on the other side. I think we need to make sure that the message gets through that we don't have it this year, folks, and that's the name of the game.
I totally agree. All the non-reps took COLA. I was told the assumption that we were going to then negotiate that way when it comes to the union contract. And so if everybody's going to pay, everybody's going to pay, and it's got to come up in the negotiations, and they've got to be put up front that that's what the deal is. That, general fund is in not very strong financially. We're not in a position to give these huge COLAs, and so we'll give you what we can give you, and that's it.
Good point. Wayne.
Christina, can you pull those numbers down, please? Sorry, they're confidential. Thank you. That was it for me.
All right, do we have agreement to go with a 6.5% vacancy rate, which will reduce our deficit to 0.3? And then Wayne, Christina will look at the areas where additional savings might be realized, and then in a week?
A week would be great. And it's not just Christina and I, it'll be with the M team. It'll just be targeted. We'll be talking to the individual members about any changes that might occur in their office or department budgets.
If I didn't say that, I meant that, yeah.
Okay.
But the two of you will look at the budget and then be talking with different department heads and coming to some consensus as to some savings.
Yep.
And we'll see how close we get to balancing the budget when we come back. I'm going to say it. I think kind of reduction of staffing, we're not necessarily addressing a structural problem. One of the ways to do that would be through attrition. Just throw that on the table. All right, wait, Roy, go ahead.
One last thing, we were talking about, the union negotiations not really being calculated in. The other thing that I haven't heard is, some of us put in, where's that number at?
Well, I think, as we discussed last time, let's get the budget balanced, and then we can take a look at trying to prioritize some of the decision packages. Additional FTE would be a particular challenge based on the conversations we've had today. But there may be some one-time funds that can be used if we prioritize some of the decision packages that don't involve FTE. Having said that, I know ANO has potential additional new revenue, which might support an increase in FTE. The Board of Commissioners discussed planning fees yesterday, and the planning department is in the process of increasing those. If those increased revenues generate enough support for FTE or partial FTE, that's something that might make sense. But that's my thoughts on FTE and decision packages.
Commissioner Hunt, as a practical matter, when the potential revenue increase based on that modest fee increase was only like $15,000 or $20,000. So that's really not necessarily a solution. Again, what I pointed out, and I don't want to belabor our little departments, but the legislature just may give 3 years of funding to planning departments to hire another individual. So that's a completely different than all the difficult things we're talking about here. And if in fact, if we're part of for us to get another septic person to be able to work with the sheriff's office on vacation rentals to be able to, because the demands that they place on our septic program, again, I think that's all, we all understand that that's new revenue basically. That's not having to compete with what we're doing here. So I think we all understand that's, yeah, if you can come to the table with money, that on a decision package, that's of course a very different thing than just saying, well, you know, I got a lot of needs and I need to access general fund to do that.
Yeah. No, good point.
Can I just say, isn't it true, the narrative that I got when I came here 9 years ago was that when the big recession hit, yeah, there were a couple, and I just came in right after the house had burned down. So it was 2012. So things were starting to get better, but isn't it true that and it's a compliment to Lincoln County, that Lincoln County saw some of these troubles coming in advance and started making structural changes in advance of the recession, right? And I, it's not my narrative, but I thought I recalled hearing that quite a bit when I first came on board. And I offer that as something to make us feel a little better, because I think there's a long tradition here of Lincoln County staring these economic issues in the eye and acting appropriately and making structural changes. So if that narrative is not quite right, maybe we don't even need to hear that today. But I like that narrative. I like that we have the DNA to do this, and we have done it, and we've done it well in advance with the that was one of the reasons for M-Team to begin with, right? Was to try to make that kind of stuff work. So thank you for letting me share that.
No, good point. Other comments? Okay, I'm not sure where we're at. Wayne, go ahead.
I think you've given us some tasks to undertake, and we're going to come back. I just need to ask Christina, if we were to come back on April 7th in the morning, is that running it too late to make some adjustments for you to get this out to the budget committee?
Let me check my calendar really quick.
Isn't that M-Team that morning too?
Yeah, so we just do this in lieu of that.
I can probably make that work.
Okay. So we'll come back on April 7th and see where we're at.
Agreement with a 6.5 vacancy. That's a step. So unless I see my fellow commissioners shaking their heads or giving me nasty looks, they're smiling, or at least Katie's smiling. Okay, so that is one adjustment that can be made to reduce that figure. And then Wayne and Christina will get together, look at budgets, talk with department heads and see what other savings can be realized. And we'll get back together, talk again on the 7th. Roy, I didn't mean a discussion on decision packages, but certainly once I think we've got our budget under control, we can take a look at decision packages.
Yeah, no, I didn't take it that way. I was just throwing it back after because we're talking about one thing, yet we have all this other stuff hanging out there, and you can't forget about it either. So yeah, no, it's fine.
Good reminder. Thank you. All right. Any last comments?
Is it realistic to basically ask union friends to hold the line and understand? I mean, or is that perhaps it was a terrible way to end the conversation and let's just go to work.
That's for collective bargaining, and we're in the process.
Forget I even asked that, so.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
All right. We'll forget on them. All right. Any last words? Christina, your mic's green.
I'm sorry, I do
No,
not have
it's
any.
okay. I didn't know if you had any last thing. All right. Well, I think we've made progress. We've got more work to do. I appreciate everybody's willingness to look at possible solutions, and we'll continue to move forward. So thank you all. We'll see everybody for the budget meeting in lieu of the M-Team meeting on Wednesday, April 7th at 9:30, correct, Wayne? Okay. All right. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon. We gave you some time back.
Got it?